They called her just a bartender who belonged behind a counter mixing drinks and wiping down glasses. But when the FBI's elite tactical unit couldn't disassemble a modified weapon fast enough to prevent a catastrophe, Cassandra Cass Reeves assembled a Glock from scattered parts in 6 seconds flat using nothing but muscle memory and skills that had been dismissed as irrelevant. In that moment, everyone who'd ever underestimated the quiet woman with calloused hands and grease under her fingernails realized they'd been looking at one of the most gifted gunsmiths in the country. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The late afternoon sun blazed through the tall windows of Meridian Federal Building in downtown Ashford, casting long shadows across the marble floors as Cass stepped through the security checkpoint. Her worn leather boots squeaked softly against the polished stone, a sound that seemed amplified in the cathedral-like silence of the government complex. She wore dark jeans that had seen better days, a simple black t-shirt, and a faded denim jacket that carried the faint scent of gun oil and metal polish aromas that had become as much a part of her as her own skin dot in her right hand. She carried a small canvas tool bag that looked like something a mechanic might use, its edges frayed from years of use and handling. The bag contained precision instruments that most people wouldn't recognize: custom punches, specialized Allen keys, spring compression tools, and measuring devices calibrated to tolerances that weapons manufacturers considered proprietary secrets. Every tool had been acquired through years of study, practice, and an obsession with mechanical perfection that had started in her grandfather's workshop when she was 12 years old. The Federal Building buzzed with the controlled energy of people who took themselves very seriously. Men in expensive suits moved through the corridors with purposeful strides, their polished shoes clicking against the marble in rhythms that spoke of authority and importance. Women in tailored blazers carried briefcases and tablets, their conversations filled with acronyms and department codes that defined the hidden language of federal bureaucracy. Cass looked like she'd wandered in from a different world entirely. Her shoulder-length brown hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail secured with a plain elastic band, not the careful styling that seemed standard among the building's usual occupants. Her hands, which she kept loosely at her sides, bore the honest marks of someone who worked with tools and machinery: small scars from metal edges, calluses from repetitive motions, and fingernails kept short not for fashion but for function. She'd been mixing drinks at Murphy's Tap House in the warehouse district for 3 years, a job that paid the bills while she pursued her real passion in the basement workshop she'd built beneath her small apartment. The bar's clientele consisted mainly of dock workers, truck drivers, and the occasional group of college students looking for cheap beer in an atmosphere that didn't try too hard to impress anyone. Most customers saw her as exactly what she appeared to be: a competent bartender who could pull a perfect pint, remember complex drink orders, and handle the occasional rowdy customer with calm professionalism. None of them knew that she could field strip and reassemble virtually any firearm manufactured in the last 50 years, often faster than the people who designed them. None of them knew that she'd spent countless hours studying ballistics, metallurgy, and precision engineering through correspondence courses and technical manuals that she ordered from obscure suppliers. None of them knew that her basement workshop contained a collection of tools and reference materials that would have impressed engineers at major weapons manufacturers. The elevator ride to the 10th floor was silent except for the soft mechanical hum of cables and pulleys. Cass shared the small space with 2 federal agents who wore their authority like expensive cologne, obvious and overwhelming. They glanced at her with the casual dismissal reserved for people who clearly didn't belong in their world of clearances and classifications. One agent, a tall man with graying temples and a suit that probably cost more than Cass made in a month, checked his phone with the impatience of someone accustomed to having his time respected. When the elevator doors opened, Cass stepped into a corridor lined with offices that radiated institutional importance. Plaques beside doorways announced titles that sounded impressive, even when you weren't sure what they meant. Deputy Assistant Director of Strategic Operations, Senior Advisor for Tactical Assessment, Coordinator of Specialized Response Initiatives. The walls were decorated with photographs of officials shaking hands with other officials, all of them looking appropriately serious about matters of national significance. The reception area for the Specialized Weapons Analysis Division featured furniture that had been selected to convey both efficiency and authority. Chrome and glass surfaces reflected the overhead lighting, creating an atmosphere that felt more like a corporate boardroom than a government office. Behind a mahogany desk that could have served as a small landing strip, a receptionist with perfect makeup and a precisely arranged blouse looked up from her computer screen with practiced politeness. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone carrying the subtle suggestion that Cass might have taken a wrong turn somewhere between the parking garage and this rarefied atmosphere of federal importance. Cass reached into her jacket pocket and withdrew a folded letter that had arrived at her apartment 3 weeks earlier. The envelope had borne the seal of the Department of Justice and contained a request that had seemed so unlikely she'd read it 4 times before accepting that it was genuine. The letter had been signed by Director Amanda Holloway, a woman whose reputation in law enforcement circles was legendary, but whose direct contact with bartenders and warehouse district pubs was presumably non-existent. "I'm here to see Director Holloway," Cass said quietly, her voice carrying the calm confidence of someone who'd learned that speaking loudly didn't make you more likely to be heard. "I have an appointment." The receptionist's expression shifted slightly as she scanned the letter, her eyebrows rising almost imperceptibly as she noted the official letterhead and signature. She glanced at her computer screen, then back at Cass, clearly trying to reconcile the woman standing before her with whatever she'd expected based on the appointment listing. "Please have a seat," the receptionist said, her tone now professionally neutral. "Director Holloway will be with you shortly." Cass settled into one of the leather chairs that faced the reception desk, her tool bag resting on the floor beside her feet. Around her, the machinery of federal law enforcement continued its quiet operations. Phones rang in distant offices, printers hummed with classified documents, and somewhere down the hall, voices discussed matters that would never appear in newspaper headlines but would shape policy decisions that affected millions of people. She waited with the patience of someone who'd learned not to expect the world to move at her preferred pace. Her hands folded in her lap, her expression calm and attentive. To anyone observing, she looked like exactly what she was, a working-class woman who'd been invited into a world where she clearly didn't belong, carrying tools that suggested skills that had nothing to do with mixing drinks or wiping down bar tops. In 20 minutes, Director Holloway would discover that the quiet bartender with the canvas tool bag possessed knowledge that could solve problems her entire specialized division couldn't handle. But for now, Cass simply sat and waited, unaware that she was about to enter a situation where being underestimated would prove to be her greatest advantage. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The conference room buzzed with the kind of tension that comes when highly trained professionals encounter something they can't immediately categorize. Cass sat at the far end of a polished mahogany table that could have hosted peace negotiations, surrounded by men and women whose credentials hung on the walls like trophies from an academic hunting expedition. Advanced degrees from prestigious universities, certifications in specialized fields, and commendations from agencies that operated in the shadows of national security. Agent Derek Thornfield, a 15-year veteran of the FBI's Tactical Weapons Division, glanced at Cass with barely concealed bewilderment. His salt and pepper beard was trimmed with military precision, and his navy blazer bore the subtle bulge of a shoulder holster that suggested he was comfortable with violence when necessary. He leaned back in his chair and addressed Director Holloway with the tone of someone who'd earned the right to speak freely. "Ma'am, with all due respect, I'm not sure why we're bringing civilians into a classified weapons analysis situation," he said, his voice carrying the weight of authority built through years of successful operations. "Especially civilians with no apparent credentials in firearms technology or federal law enforcement." Dr. Patricia Vance, the division's chief weapons analyst, nodded in agreement while shuffling through a stack of technical reports. Her Ph.D. in mechanical engineering from Stanford was prominently displayed behind her chair, flanked by certificates in ballistics analysis and materials science. She wore wire-rimmed glasses that gave her the appearance of someone who solved problems through academic rigor rather than practical experience. "The modifications we're dealing with require expertise in advanced metallurgy and precision machining," Dr. Vance said, her tone suggesting that such expertise couldn't possibly reside in someone who spent her days serving alcohol to blue-collar workers. "We need someone with graduate-level training in materials science, not someone who ... She paused, glancing at Cass's canvas tool bag with obvious skepticism. ... Works in food service. Agent Lisa Carmichael, a rising star in the weapons trafficking division, couldn't suppress a slight smile as she reviewed Cass's background information on her tablet. At 32, Carmichael had built her reputation by infiltrating arms-dealing networks that other agents couldn't penetrate, using a combination of advanced technology and cutting-edge investigative techniques. According to this file, Ms. Reeves has no formal training in weapons systems, Carmichael said, reading from her screen with the clinical detachment of someone presenting evidence. "No military background, no engineering degree, no certifications from recognized training institutions. Her employment history shows 3 years at a neighborhood bar, and before that, various service industry jobs." She looked up from her tablet and addressed Cass directly for the first time. "No offense, but what exactly qualifies you to assist with analysis that has stumped teams of experts with decades of specialized training?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Around the table, other personnel exchanged glances that ranged from curious to dismissive. Agent Robert Hayes, a former Marine explosives expert, drummed his fingers against the table with the rhythm of someone who'd rather be solving problems with action than sitting through meetings with unqualified participants. "This is a waste of time," Hayes muttered under his breath, just loud enough for everyone to hear. "We've got a complex technical problem that requires specialized knowledge, and we're consulting someone whose biggest challenge is probably remembering whether customers want their drinks stirred or shaken." Quiet laughter rippled around the table, the kind of polite amusement that people in positions of authority use to maintain social cohesion while dismissing inconvenient elements. Dr. Vance smiled thinly and returned her attention to the technical specifications spread before her, clearly considering the matter settled. Agent Thornfield leaned forward with the patience of someone explaining obvious facts to a child. "Ms. Reeves, I'm sure you're very good at what you do," he said, his tone suggesting that what she did was of minimal importance to anyone in the room. "But weapons analysis requires years of specialized training. We're dealing with modifications that violate federal regulations, using techniques that most qualified experts have never encountered." He gestured toward the credentials displayed around the room. "Everyone here has spent years developing expertise in specific areas of weapons technology. Dr. Vance has published papers on metallurgical stress analysis. Agent Carmichael has infiltrated international arms networks. Agent Hayes has disarmed explosives in active combat zones." His implication was clear. What could a bartender possibly contribute to such a distinguished gathering of expertise? Director Holloway, who had remained silent during the exchange, watched Cass carefully. The director was known for making decisions that others couldn't understand until results proved their wisdom. But even she seemed uncertain about the wisdom of including someone so obviously outside the professional mainstream. Perhaps we should at least hear why Ms. Reeves was recommended for this consultation, Holloway said diplomatically, though her tone suggested she was already preparing to thank Cass for her time and escort her back to the elevator. Agent Carmichael consulted her tablet again. The recommendation came through unofficial channels, she said, emphasizing the word unofficial, with the disdain reserved for intelligence that hadn't been properly vetted through bureaucratic procedures. Someone apparently mentioned her name during a conversation about unconventional approaches to weapons modifications. Unconventional is right, Dr. Vance muttered while organizing her technical drawings into neat stacks. We need proven methodologies, not folk wisdom from someone who learned about mechanics by changing oil in pickup trucks. The dismissal was complete and devastating. Cass sat quietly through the entire exchange, her expression revealing nothing while federal agents and technical experts systematically dismantled any possibility that she could contribute meaningfully to their work. Her canvas tool bag sat beside her chair like evidence of her inadequacy, its worn appearance contrasting sharply with the leather briefcases and high-tech equipment cases that surrounded the table. Agent Hayes checked his watch with obvious impatience. "Director, we're burning daylight here," he said. "The weapons in question are still out there, and we need to focus on solutions that come from people who actually understand advanced firearms technology." Around the table, heads nodded in agreement. The consensus was clear. They were professionals dealing with professional problems, and amateur hour needed to end so real work could begin. Cass remained silent, her hands folded in her lap, her expression calm despite the systematic destruction of her credibility by people who'd never seen her work. She'd encountered this kind of dismissal before, in different contexts and different rooms, from people who confused credentials with competence and assumed that unconventional backgrounds inevitably produced inferior results. In 15 minutes, she would be asked to examine weapons that had confounded everyone in the room. But for now, she simply endured the quiet humiliation of being judged inadequate by people who measured capability through degrees and certifications rather than results. The bartender, who could assemble a Glock in 6 seconds, said nothing while experts explained why she couldn't possibly understand weapons well enough to help them solve their impossible problem. The massive steel door of Evidence Vault C opened with a pneumatic hiss that seemed to exhale years of accumulated secrets. Director Holloway led the group through the reinforced threshold into a climate-controlled chamber that housed the kind of weapons that never appeared in public crime statistics. The air inside carried the metallic scent of gun oil mixed with the sterile atmosphere of a high-security laboratory, where dangerous objects waited in hermetically sealed containers for experts to decode their mysteries. Agent Thornfield approached a series of stainless steel examination tables where 3 weapons lay in various states of disassembly, each one surrounded by evidence tags and technical documentation that told a story of repeated failure. The first table held what appeared to be a standard Glock 19, but even from a distance, Cass could see modifications that transformed the familiar silhouette into something far more complex and dangerous. 3 weeks ago, customs agents in Port Valdres intercepted a shipping container from an unknown manufacturer. Director Holloway began, her voice taking on the measured tone of someone delivering a briefing that had been repeated many times. The container held 47 weapons that appeared to be standard handguns, but every single one had been modified using techniques that our best analysts can't identify or replicate. Dr. Vance stepped forward with a tablet displaying high-resolution photographs of the weapon's internal components. Her academic confidence seemed less certain now, replaced by the frustrated precision of someone who'd encountered a problem that didn't respond to conventional expertise. The modifications allow these weapons to cycle at rates that should be mechanically impossible given their original design specifications, she explained. We're seeing firing rates that approach those of automatic weapons, but achieved through alterations that violate everything we understand about physics and metallurgy. Agent Carmichael activated a wall-mounted display screen that showed ballistics test results with numbers that seemed to defy rational explanation. The modified weapons maintain accuracy at ranges that shouldn't be achievable with handgun platforms, she said, pointing to groupings that looked more like rifle performance than pistol results. But more concerning is their reliability. We've run stress tests that would destroy conventional firearms, and these modifications actually improve performance under extreme conditions. The room fell silent as the implications settled over everyone present. Agent Hayes moved to the second examination table, where a partially disassembled weapon revealed internal components that looked like they'd been crafted by someone who understood metallurgy at a level that transcended formal training. The problem is that we can't figure out how they work, he said, his frustration evident in every word. We've had these weapons for 3 weeks, and our most experienced technicians can't safely disassemble them without risking permanent damage. To the evidence. Director Holloway gestured toward a thick folder filled with technical reports, each one bearing the official seals of different federal agencies and private laboratories. We've consulted experts from the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, the Defense Department's Weapons Research Division, and 3 private contractors with security clearances that require congressional approval, she said. Every single analysis has reached the same conclusion. The modifications are too complex and delicate to reverse engineer without destroying the weapons in the process. Dr. Vance pulled up detailed schematic drawings on her tablet, each one showing internal components that seemed to function according to principles that existing technology couldn't explain. The modifications appear to involve alterations to the firing pin assembly, trigger mechanism, and barrel rifling that should be mutually incompatible, she said, her academic training clearly struggling with mechanical realities that didn't conform to established theories. But somehow they work together to create performance characteristics that our computer models say are impossible. Agent Thornfield opened a secure filing cabinet and withdrew a stack of photographs, showing similar weapons that had been discovered in criminal investigations across 3 different states. This isn't an isolated incident, he said grimly. We've identified at least 12 separate cases where modified weapons with identical characteristics have been used in crimes ranging from armed robbery to assassination attempts. The modifications make these weapons exponentially more dangerous than anything currently available through legal or illegal channels. The wall display showed a map of the United States with red dots marking locations where similar weapons had been encountered by law enforcement. The pattern suggested a distribution network that operated with sophisticated logistics and manufacturing capabilities that went far beyond typical illegal weapons trafficking. The situation is escalating, Director Holloway continued, her voice carrying the weight of someone who understood the broader implications of what they were facing. Intelligence reports suggest that whoever is producing these modifications has the capacity to scale up production significantly. We could be looking at a fundamental shift in the illegal weapons marketplace, with firearms that give criminals capabilities that law enforcement agencies aren't equipped to counter. Agent Carmichael moved to the 3rd examination table, where a weapon had been partially disassembled by previous analysis attempts. The internal components were visible through a transparent protective barrier, revealing modifications that looked like precision artwork combined with advanced engineering. Our attempts to understand the modification process have been limited by the delicate nature of the alterations, she explained. Every time we try to disassemble one of these weapons completely, we risk destroying the very modifications we're trying to study. The frustration in the room was palpable. Here were federal agents and technical experts with decades of combined experience, facing weapons that operated according to principles they couldn't understand, using modifications they couldn't safely examine. The usual tools of investigation and analysis had proven inadequate when confronted with craftsmanship that exceeded their technical capabilities. Dr. Vance pulled up a series of X-ray images that showed the internal structure of the modified weapons in detail. "We can see what has been done," she said, pointing to areas where original components had been altered with precision that looked almost surgical. "But we can't determine how it was done, what tools were used, or what sequence of modifications produces these results. It's like trying to reverse engineer a Swiss watch by looking at photographs." Agent Hayes gestured toward a collection of specialized tools that had been used in previous analysis attempts. "We've tried every standard disassembly technique in our arsenal," he said, his military background evident in his systematic approach to problem solving. "But these modifications require a level of precision and understanding that goes beyond conventional weapons training. We need someone who thinks about firearms the way an artist thinks about sculpture." The challenge was clear and daunting. 3 weeks of expert analysis had produced detailed documentation of what the modified weapons could do, but no understanding of how the modifications worked or how to safely study them. The weapons remained mysterious and dangerous, their secrets locked away by craftsmanship that transcended conventional expertise. "Director," Holloway turned toward the group with the expression of someone who'd exhausted all conventional options and was preparing to try something unprecedented. "We need to understand these modifications before more weapons reach the streets," she said. "But every standard approach has failed. We need someone who can look at these weapons with fresh eyes, someone who understands firearms from a perspective that formal training doesn't provide." Around the room, federal agents and technical experts stood surrounded by evidence of their collective failure to solve a problem that grew more dangerous with each passing day. The modified weapons lay on their examination tables like mechanical puzzles that had defeated everyone who tried to unlock their secrets, waiting for someone with the unconventional expertise necessary to reveal how impossible had been made possible. The silence that followed Director Holloway's explanation stretched uncomfortably as the assembled experts processed the magnitude of their collective failure. Cass stepped closer to the examination tables, her eyes moving systematically across the modified weapons with the focused attention of someone reading a familiar language. She could see details that the high-resolution photographs hadn't captured. Tool marks that suggested specific manufacturing techniques, wear patterns that indicated particular assembly sequences, and modifications that followed principles her grandfather had taught her in his workshop decades ago. Agent Thornfield noticed her intense examination of the weapons and immediately moved to block her view. "Ms. Reeves, these are classified federal evidence," he said sharply, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to absolute compliance. "Unauthorized personnel cannot have direct access to materials involved in ongoing federal investigations. Please step back from the examination area." The rebuke was swift and decisive, delivered with the kind of bureaucratic finality that ended discussions before they could begin. Around the room, other agents nodded in agreement, their expressions reflecting relief that proper protocols were being enforced. Despite the unusual circumstances that had brought a civilian into their secured facility, Dr. Vance looked up from her tablet with the expression of someone who just witnessed a significant breach of professional standards. "Director, I have to object to allowing untrained personnel this close to evidence that multiple agencies have classified as sensitive materials," she said, her academic credentials lending weight to her concerns. "We have strict chain of custody requirements and security protocols that exist for very good reasons." Agent Carmichael consulted her own device and highlighted several regulatory citations that supported Dr. Vance's objection. "Federal weapons analysis requires security clearances that take months to obtain and verify," she said, reading from official guidelines with the precision of someone who'd memorized complex regulations. "Ms. Reeves hasn't undergone background checks, psychological evaluation, or any of the standard screening procedures required for access to classified materials. The institutional machinery of federal law enforcement was moving to protect itself from the irregularity of including someone who didn't fit established categories. Agent Hayes stepped forward with the measured confidence of someone who'd spent years following military protocols that had kept him alive in dangerous situations. With respect, Director, we can't compromise operational security based on hunches or unofficial recommendations, he said, his tone suggesting that such compromises led inevitably to catastrophic failures. These weapons represent a clear and present danger to national security. We need analysis conducted by personnel with verified credentials and established track records in classified environments. Director Holloway found herself caught between the mounting pressure from her subordinates and her own doubts about the wisdom of involving someone so obviously outside the federal law enforcement mainstream. The bureaucratic weight of proper procedures pressed against her instinct that conventional approaches had already failed spectacularly. Perhaps we should reconsider the parameters of this consultation, she said diplomatically, her voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone trying to extract herself from a decision that was beginning to look increasingly problematic. Ms. Reeves, we appreciate your willingness to assist, but the specialized nature of this investigation requires adherence to protocols that ensure both security and evidentiary integrity. The dismissal was polite but absolute. Agent Thornfield moved to escort Cass away from the examination tables while Dr. Vance began reorganizing her technical materials with the efficiency of someone relieved to return to familiar professional territory. The brief experiment with unconventional expertise was ending before it had really begun. Agent Carmichael addressed the director with the respectful firmness of someone presenting unavoidable facts. Ma'am, Ms. Reeves lacks the educational background to understand the technical complexities we're dealing with, she said, gesturing toward the modified weapons with their mysterious alterations. These modifications involve advanced metallurgy, precision machining, and ballistics principles that require graduate-level training to comprehend. We can't risk compromising our investigation by involving someone without the necessary technical foundation. The logic was unassailable within the framework of federal bureaucracy. Credentials mattered because they provided predictable measures of competence and reliability. Educational backgrounds could be verified, professional experience could be documented, and security clearances ensured that sensitive information remained within controlled channels. Cass possessed none of these institutional markers of trustworthiness and capability. Dr. Vance pulled up her computer models and ballistics calculations, using them as visual evidence of the technical sophistication required for meaningful analysis. We're dealing with modifications that challenge fundamental assumptions about weapons physics, she explained, her tone suggesting that such challenges could only be met by people with extensive formal training. Understanding these alterations requires familiarity with materials science, stress analysis, and manufacturing processes that aren't covered in vocational training programs. Agent Hayes opened a filing cabinet and withdrew a thick manual outlining federal protocols for classified materials handling. Every person who accesses these weapons must be vetted through a process that takes months and involves extensive background investigation, he said, reading from procedures that had been developed over decades of security concerns. We can't simply waive requirements because traditional analysis methods haven't produced immediate results. The institutional momentum was building toward a conclusion that everyone in the room could accept with professional satisfaction. They had followed proper procedures, consulted appropriate experts, and maintained security protocols that protected sensitive information from unauthorized access. If their conventional approaches had failed to solve the problem, that simply meant they needed more time and resources, not compromise standards and irregular consultations. Agent Thornfield prepared to escort Cass from the evidence vault while The other experts began discussing alternative approaches that remained within acceptable bureaucratic boundaries. They could request additional funding for specialized equipment, contract with different technical consultants who possessed appropriate credentials, or escalate the investigation to federal agencies with more extensive resources and expertise. "Ms. Reeves, thank you for your time," Director Holloway said with the diplomatic courtesy reserved for concluding unsuccessful meetings. "We'll be sure to contact you if future developments create opportunities for civilian consultation that align with our security requirements and operational protocols." The dismissal was complete and final. Federal agents and technical experts had successfully protected their investigation from the irregularity of including someone whose background didn't conform to institutional standards. They could return to familiar approaches that might not have solved their problem, but at least operated within comfortable boundaries of professional respectability and bureaucratic accountability. Cass stood quietly near the evidence tables, her canvas tool bag hanging from her shoulder, like a reminder of the unconventional expertise that federal protocols couldn't accommodate. Around her, people with impressive credentials and official authority, prepared to continue their unsuccessful investigation using methods that had already proven inadequate, secure in the knowledge that they had maintained proper standards even if they hadn't achieved actual results. The bartender who could assemble a Glock in 6 seconds was being escorted from a room full of weapons that had defeated every expert who'd tried to understand them. Dismissed by people who confused procedural compliance with problem-solving competence. Cass walked slowly through the sterile corridors of the Meridian Federal Building, her footsteps echoing off marble floors that seemed designed to remind visitors of their insignificance within the vast machinery of government authority. Agent Thornfield had escorted her to the elevator with the polite efficiency of someone completing an unpleasant but necessary task, his relief evident as the doors closed between them. The elevator descended through 15 floors of federal importance, each passing level taking her further from weapons that held secrets she could unlock if anyone had bothered to let her try. The late afternoon sunlight felt harsh after the controlled environment of the evidence vault, and Cass paused on the building's front steps to process what had just occurred. She'd been invited into a world of classified materials and federal expertise, shown weapons that had confounded the country's most qualified analysts, then dismissed before she could offer any meaningful contribution. The pattern was familiar, but no less frustrating for its predictability. She walked across the plaza toward the parking structure where she'd left her 15-year-old Honda Civic, a vehicle that looked even more out of place among the government sedans and official vehicles than she had looked among the federal agents. The contrast struck her as symbolic of the broader divide between her world and theirs. She drove a car that she maintained herself because she understood how engines worked, while they drove vehicles that required specialized technicians to diagnose problems that computers couldn't solve. Settling into the driver's seat, Cass didn't immediately start the engine. Instead, she sat in the relative quiet of the concrete structure and thought about the weapons she'd seen during her brief examination. The modifications weren't random improvements or crude alterations typical of illegal weapons trafficking. They represented a systematic understanding of firearms mechanics that went beyond conventional training, combining traditional craftsmanship with innovations that most experts wouldn't attempt because they'd been taught that such combinations were impossible. She'd recognized techniques that her grandfather had shown her in his workshop, methods that predated modern manufacturing but achieved precision that contemporary machinery couldn't replicate. The unknown craftsman who'd modified those weapons understood something that formal education had systematically excluded from its curriculum, that some mechanical problems could only be solved by hands that had learned to feel their way through complex assemblies, guided by intuition developed through years of practice rather than theoretical knowledge. In her brief glimpse of the evidence, Cass had seen tool marks that told a story about the modification process. The unknown craftsman had used hand-filing techniques to achieve tolerances that computer-controlled machinery would have considered unnecessary. The modifications followed principles that her grandfather had called mechanical empathy, the ability to understand how metal wanted to move and work with those natural tendencies, rather than forcing compliance through brute precision. Importantly, she'd recognized the sequence of modifications. The unknown craftsman had followed a logical progression that started with fundamental improvements to the firing mechanism, then built additional enhancements that depended on those initial changes. It was like reading a conversation between the craftsman and the weapon, each modification responding to stress patterns created by previous alterations, creating a cumulative effect that transformed the original design into something far more capable. The federal experts had approached the weapons as puzzles to be solved through analytical methods, but Cass understood them as examples of craftsmanship that could only be replicated by someone who shared the craftsman's intuitive understanding of mechanical relationships. Their academic training had actually become a limitation, preventing them from seeing solutions that didn't conform to established theoretical frameworks. Sitting in her Honda, Cass realized that the federal agents' dismissal of her capabilities wasn't just bureaucratic prejudice. They were genuinely afraid of what it would mean if she succeeded where their expensive expertise had failed. Their entire professional identity depended on the assumption that formal training produced superior results, that credentials guaranteed competence, and that institutional authority reflected actual capability. If a bartender with no security clearance could solve problems that had defeated teams of credentialed experts, what did that say about the value of their degrees, their training programs, and their elaborate procedures? Her success would represent more than just a solution to their immediate problem. It would challenge fundamental assumptions about how expertise worked and where it could be found. The realization crystallized into something approaching anger, though it was a controlled and purposeful emotion rather than explosive rage. These weapons were continuing to appear in criminal investigations, while federal experts protected their professional territory instead of seeking actual solutions. People were dying because bureaucrats were more concerned with maintaining institutional hierarchies than with stopping dangerous weapons from reaching the streets. Cass started her engine and pulled out of the parking structure, but instead of heading home to her apartment above Murphy's Tap House, she drove toward the industrial district where specialized tool suppliers operated businesses that served machinists, mechanics, and craftsmen who worked with their hands rather than their credentials. She had an idea that would require equipment that federal budgets didn't typically purchase, and techniques that weren't taught in graduate programs. The plan forming in her mind was audacious and probably illegal, but it was also the only approach that might actually produce results. If federal agents weren't interested in her expertise, she would have to demonstrate it in a way that couldn't be ignored or dismissed. She would have to prove that unconventional knowledge could solve problems that conventional wisdom couldn't even comprehend. The drive through Ashford's industrial district took her past machine shops where skilled craftsmen produced custom parts for applications that mass manufacturing couldn't accommodate. These were the places where practical knowledge lived, where problems were solved through experience and intuition rather than computer models and theoretical frameworks. This was her world, and she was going home to gather the tools and materials necessary to remind federal experts that some forms of expertise couldn't be credentialed or classified. By the time she pulled into the parking lot of Morrison's Industrial Supply, Cass had made a decision that would change everything. She wasn't going to wait for permission or official authorization. She wasn't going to accept dismissal from people who confused procedural compliance with actual competence. She was going to solve their impossible problem using methods they didn't understand, with tools they didn't recognize, following principles they'd never learned. The federal agents who'd escorted her from their classified facility had no idea that they'd just motivated someone with the knowledge and determination necessary to accomplish what their entire institutional apparatus couldn't achieve. They'd dismissed the bartender and awakened the craftsman, and that transformation would prove to be their most significant miscalculation. The basement workshop beneath Cass's apartment hummed with the kind of focused energy that came from years of accumulated knowledge finally finding its purpose. She'd spent the evening gathering materials from Morrison's Industrial Supply and 3 other specialized shops, acquiring components that federal procurement procedures would never approve, and tools that government budgets wouldn't understand. Now surrounded by precision instruments and raw materials, she began the methodical process of creating something that would force the federal experts to acknowledge what they'd dismissed. Workbench that dominated the center of the room had been built by her grandfather using techniques that prioritize stability over appearance. Its heavy oak surface bore the honest scars of decades of precise work, burn marks from soldering operations, shallow grooves from repeated cutting tasks, and oil stains that had penetrated the wood grain like badges of craftsmanship. Under the bright LED lights she'd installed to replace her grandfather's old fluorescent fixtures, every tool had its designated place, arranged not for show but for the efficiency that came from muscle memory developed through countless hours of practice. Cass pulled on the leather apron that had protected her grandfather's clothes during his most delicate work, its pockets still containing measuring tools and small implements that he'd carried for 40 years of gunsmithing. The familiar weight of the apron against her shoulders felt like putting on armor, transforming her from the dismissed bartender into the craftsman who'd inherited knowledge that couldn't be taught in schools or acquired through formal training. Programs. She opened her canvas tool bag and began arranging its contents on the workbench with the systematic precision of someone preparing for surgery. Each instrument had been selected for specific capabilities that mass-produced tools couldn't provide: hand-forged punches that could drive pins without damaging surrounding metal, custom files with tooth patterns designed for particular materials, and measuring devices calibrated to tolerances that exceeded industry standards. These were tools that her grandfather had made himself or acquired from other craftsmen who understood that some work required implements that no manufacturer would produce. From the materials she'd collected that evening, Cass selected components that would allow her to demonstrate the modification techniques she'd recognized in the federal evidence vault. A standard Glock frame provided the foundation, but she'd also acquired precision steel stock that could be machined into custom components, specialized springs with tension characteristics that weren't available through normal supply channels, and metallurgical supplies that would allow her to achieve the kind of surface treatments that had puzzled the federal experts. The plan taking shape in her mind went beyond simply replicating the modifications she'd seen. She intended to create a complete demonstration that would show not just what had been done to those weapons, but how it had been accomplished and why conventional analysis methods had failed to understand the process. It would be a masterclass in unconventional gunsmithing, delivered through practical demonstration rather than academic explanation. She began with the firing mechanism, the heart of any firearms operation and the foundation upon which all other modifications depended. Using techniques that her grandfather had learned from craftsmen who'd worked before computer-controlled machinery existed, Cass began hand-fitting components with tolerances that modern manufacturing considered unnecessary. Each part was shaped not just to technical specifications, but to work in harmony with the mechanical stresses that would be created during operation. The work required a level of tactile sensitivity that couldn't be taught through classroom instruction. Cass's fingers had learned to detect variations in metal texture that indicated stress concentrations, to feel the slight resistance that warned of improper fits, and to recognize the subtle changes in tool feedback that signaled when materials were approaching their limits. These were skills that developed through years of practice, Guided by an understanding of mechanical relationships that came from working with materials rather than studying them. As she worked, Cass documented each step with photographs and detailed notes that would create a complete record of the modification process. Unlike the federal experts who tried to reverse engineer finished weapons, she was creating a forward engineering demonstration that would show exactly how impossible performance could be achieved through techniques that formal training programs had systematically excluded from their curricula. The trigger mechanism came next, requiring modifications that would allow the weapon to cycle at rates approaching automatic fire while maintaining the reliability and accuracy that made such performance useful rather than merely destructive. The challenge wasn't just mechanical but philosophical, understanding how traditional craftsmanship principles could be applied to achieve results that modern technology considered impossible. Cass used hand-filing techniques to create bearing surfaces with characteristics that computer-controlled machinery couldn't replicate. The slightly irregular patterns, created by careful handwork, actually provided better performance than the perfect uniformity that mass production sought to achieve. It was a perfect example of how her grandfather's philosophy of mechanical empathy produced superior results through methods that formal engineering education had dismissed as obsolete. The barrel modifications required the most delicate work, involving changes to the rifling pattern that would dramatically improve accuracy while maintaining compatibility with standard ammunition. Using techniques that predated modern barrel manufacturing, Cass created spiral patterns that guided projectiles more effectively than conventional rifling, achieving performance improvements that ballistics experts would have considered theoretically impossible. Each modification built upon previous changes, creating cumulative effects that transformed the weapon's capabilities in ways that could only be understood by someone who approached firearms as integrated mechanical systems rather than collections of separate components. The federal experts had failed because they'd tried to analyze individual modifications in isolation, missing the relationships that made the overall system work. By 3 a.m, Cass had completed a demonstration weapon that incorporated all the modification techniques she'd recognized in the federal evidence vault. More importantly, she'd created a complete documentation package that would allow anyone with basic mechanical skills to understand how the modifications worked and why they produced such dramatic performance improvements. The finished weapon looked deceptively simple, its external appearance giving no hint of the sophisticated internal modifications that had transformed its capabilities. Like the weapons that had confounded federal experts, it would challenge fundamental assumptions about what was possible with conventional firearms technology. But unlike those mysterious examples, this one came with complete instructions for replication and analysis. Cass cleaned her tools with the methodical care that her grandfather had taught her, returning each instrument to its designated place with the satisfaction of someone who'd completed important work using knowledge that couldn't be acquired through formal channels. In 6 hours, she would contact Director Holloway and request another meeting, armed this time with proof that unconventional expertise could solve problems that conventional wisdom couldn't even comprehend. The morning air carried the crisp bite of autumn as Cass walked across the plaza toward the Meridian Federal Building, her modified canvas bag now containing evidence that would shatter every assumption the federal experts had made about her capabilities. She'd called Director Holloway at 7 a.m., requesting an emergency meeting with language that had cut through bureaucratic hesitation like a blade through silk. "I can demonstrate the modification techniques your experts can't understand," she'd said simply. "Give me 30 minutes and I'll solve your impossible problem." The security checkpoint recognized her from the previous day, but the guard's casual dismissal had been replaced by something approaching curiosity. Word had somehow spread through the building's unofficial communication networks that the bartender was returning with claims that sounded like either breakthrough or delusion. The metal detector registered the presence of mechanical components in her bag, prompting additional screening that revealed precision instruments and what appeared to be firearm parts arranged with the careful organization of someone who understood exactly what they were carrying. "Ma'am, we'll need to inspect these materials before you can proceed to your meeting," the senior security officer said, his tone professional, but tinged with uncertainty about how to handle evidence that didn't fit standard categories. The components in Cass's bag were clearly related to weapons technology, but they'd been arranged and documented in ways that suggested analysis rather than threat. Director Holloway arrived at the security checkpoint within minutes, having been notified that her unexpected visitor was carrying materials that required executive clearance for building access. She examined the contents of Cass's bag with the focused attention of someone who'd learned to recognize when situations were about to change dramatically. The modified weapon components were accompanied by detailed documentation that looked more comprehensive than reports produced by her own technical staff. "Ms. Reeves, what exactly are you proposing to demonstrate?" Holloway asked, her voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone navigating uncharted bureaucratic territory. "The modification techniques that stumped your entire analysis team," Cass replied, her tone quiet but absolutely certain. "I've recreated the process using methods your experts dismissed as impossible. I can show you how these weapons work, why they work, and how to safely analyze them without destroying evidence." The elevator ride to the 10th floor was charged with tension that had nothing to do with mechanical systems. Director Holloway reviewed the documentation that Cass had prepared, her expression shifting from skepticism to intense interest as she processed technical details that addressed every limitation her experts had encountered. The material suggested a level of understanding that went far beyond theoretical knowledge, demonstrating practical expertise that could only come from hands-on experience with advanced modification techniques. Agent Thornfield was waiting outside the evidence vault when they arrived, his expression reflecting the kind of professional irritation that came from having carefully established procedures disrupted by irregular requests. "Director, I have to object to bringing unauthorized materials into a classified facility," he said, gesturing toward Cass's bag with obvious concern. "We have protocols that govern the introduction of potentially compromised evidence." "These aren't compromised materials," Cass said, opening her bag to reveal the modified weapon she'd completed during her night in the workshop. "This is a complete demonstration of the modification process that your team couldn't reverse engineer. Every technique used on your evidence vault weapons is documented here with step-by-step instructions for replication and analysis." The assembled experts gathered around the evidence table as Cass began laying out her materials with the systematic precision of someone delivering a presentation that had been planned to the smallest detail. The modified weapon she produced looked almost identical to the mysterious examples that had defeated their analysis, but it was accompanied by documentation that transformed an incomprehensible puzzle into a comprehensible demonstration of advanced craftsmanship. Dr. Vance approached the table with the wariness of someone whose professional expertise was about to be challenged by methods she'd been trained to dismiss. "Ms. Reeves, these modifications appear to violate fundamental principles of firearms engineering," she said, examining the weapon with instruments that detected performance characteristics that shouldn't have been possible with the materials, and techniques that appeared to have been used. "They violate the principles you learned in graduate school," Cass replied, beginning the disassembly process with movements that looked almost choreographed. "But they follow older principles that formal education systematically excluded from engineering curricula. Your computer models can't predict these results because they're based on assumptions about how metal should behave rather than understanding how it actually behaves under specific conditions." Her hands moved through the disassembly sequence with the fluid precision of someone performing a familiar ritual, each component removed and placed with careful attention to relationships that weren't obvious to observers who'd never seen such work performed. The modified firing mechanism came apart in her hands like a puzzle that had been designed for easy reassembly, revealing internal components that looked like precision. Artwork combined with advanced engineering. Agent Carmichael tried to document the process with her tablet, but the speed and complexity of Cass's movements required understanding that went beyond visual observation. "How are you accomplishing disassembly that our experts considered too dangerous to attempt?" she asked, her voice reflecting professional confusion mixed with growing respect. "Because I understand how these modifications were made," Cass said, exposing the trigger mechanism that had puzzled federal analysts for 3 weeks. "Your experts approached these weapons as mysteries to be solved through analysis, but I recognize them as examples of craftsmanship that follows specific traditions. Once you understand the philosophy behind the modifications, the technical implementation becomes straightforward." Agent Hayes watched the demonstration with the focused attention of someone whose military training had taught him to recognize superior expertise regardless of its source. The precision and confidence of Cass's work was undeniable, but more importantly, her explanations were revealing solutions to problems that had seemed insurmountable just hours earlier. "These modification techniques aren't random improvements," Cass continued, rebuilding the weapon with the same fluid efficiency she'd shown during disassembly. "They're systematic applications of traditional gunsmithing principles that predate modern manufacturing. The unknown craftsman who created your evidence vault weapons learned these techniques from sources that formal education doesn't recognize or preserve." The demonstration reached its climax when Cass completed the reassembly process and invited the federal experts to conduct their own performance tests using equipment that would verify the weapon's impossible capabilities. The results matched those that had confounded their analysis for weeks, but now they had complete documentation of how such performance had been achieved. Director Holloway realized that she was witnessing more than just a technical demonstration. The quiet bartender with the canvas tool bag had just proven that institutional expertise could be wrong, that formal credentials didn't guarantee competence, and that solutions to impossible problems sometimes came from sources that bureaucratic procedures systematically excluded. The point of no return had been reached. Cass had demonstrated capabilities that couldn't be dismissed or explained away, using knowledge that challenged fundamental assumptions about where expertise could be found and how complex problems should be solved. The federal experts who dismissed her 24 hours earlier now faced the undeniable fact that she possessed understanding they lacked and could accomplish what their entire institutional apparatus couldn't achieve. The emergency alert that shattered the morning's demonstration came through multiple communication channels simultaneously, turning the evidence vault into a command center within seconds. Agent Carmichael's radio crackled with urgent voices reporting a situation that transformed Cass's theoretical demonstration into immediate practical necessity. Federal marshals had cornered 3 armed suspects in a downtown warehouse, but the suspects were carrying weapons identical to those in the evidence vault, and the standoff was escalating beyond conventional law enforcement capabilities. Shots fired at the federal courthouse. The dispatcher's voice cut through static with professional urgency. Multiple suspects with modified weapons displaying automatic level firing rates. Standard tactical response ineffective. Requesting immediate technical support for weapon neutralization. Director Holloway's expression shifted from administrative concern to operational crisis management as additional reports flooded through communication systems. The modified weapons weren't just evidence anymore. They were active threats being used against federal officers in real time. The theoretical problem that had puzzled experts for weeks had become a tactical emergency that demanded immediate solutions. Agent Thornfield coordinated with tactical teams through his headset while monitoring video feeds from the courthouse area. The suspects have taken positions that allow covering fire with sustained automatic rates. he reported, his military experience evident in his rapid assessment of the tactical situation. Our teams can't advance because these weapons are maintaining suppressive fire that shouldn't be possible with handgun platforms. The video displays showed federal agents pinned down behind concrete barriers while modified weapons produced muzzle flashes and firing rates that defied everything law enforcement had been trained to expect from such situations. Standard tactical responses were failing because the weapons exceeded the performance parameters that protocols had been designed to counter. Dr. Vance pulled up ballistics data from the courthouse engagement, her academic training struggling to process real-time combat results that violated theoretical predictions. The firing rates we're observing are mechanically impossible, she said, her voice reflecting the confusion of someone whose expertise was being contradicted by empirical evidence. These weapons shouldn't be capable of sustained automatic fire without catastrophic mechanical failure. Agent Hayes analyzed the tactical situation with the systematic approach he'd learned during military service, but his conventional training offered no solutions for weapons that perform but unexpected capabilities. Standard breach procedures won't work if these weapons can maintain suppressive fire at automatic rates, he said grimly. We need new tactical approaches for threats that exceed our operational assumptions. Director Holloway turned toward Cass with the expression of someone whose theoretical problems had suddenly become matters of life and death. Ms. Reeves, can your understanding of these modifications help us develop countermeasures that will allow our tactical teams to advance safely? The question carried weight that went far beyond technical consultation. Federal officers were trapped in a firefight with weapons that conventional training hadn't prepared them to face, and the expertise that bureaucratic procedures had dismissed. Hours earlier was now the only available solution to an immediate crisis. Cass studied the video feeds with the focused intensity of someone reading tactical information through mechanical understanding rather than military training. The modified weapons were being used in ways that revealed operational characteristics that formal analysis had missed, displaying capabilities that she could interpret through her understanding of the modification process. The modifications that increase firing rate also create specific vulnerabilities, she said, her voice carrying the calm certainty of someone whose knowledge was finally being applied to its intended purpose. The rapid cycling puts extreme stress on components that weren't designed for sustained automatic operation. There are ways to exploit those stress points if your tactical teams can create the right conditions. She moved to the evidence table and began rapid disassembly of one of the vault weapons, her hands working with practiced efficiency while explaining vulnerabilities that weren't obvious to observers who didn't understand the modification process. The increased firing rate is achieved by reducing safety margins that prevent mechanical failure, she explained, exposing internal components that showed signs of stress concentration. Push these weapons beyond their operational limits and they'll destroy themselves. Agent Carmichael monitored radio communications from the courthouse while trying to translate Cass's technical explanation into tactical recommendations. How do we create conditions that would force weapon failure? She asked, her training in criminal investigation providing no framework for mechanical sabotage of firearms during active engagements. Heat buildup, Cass replied, reassembling the weapon with movements that looked like controlled urgency. The modifications increase performance by operating closer to thermal limits. Sustained fire will cause barrel expansion that disrupts the precision tolerances that make the modifications work. Force them to maintain continuous fire for 60 seconds, and the weapons will jam or misfire. The solution was elegant in its simplicity, but implementing it required tactical expertise that could translate mechanical understanding into operational reality. Agent Thornfield coordinated with field commanders while Cass provided technical specifications that would allow federal teams to exploit vulnerabilities in weapons that had seemed unstoppable minutes earlier. Federal teams are implementing suppression tactics designed to force sustained return fire, Thornfield reported, his voice reflecting the tension of someone coordinating dangerous operations in real time. Ms. Reeves' analysis suggests that forcing continuous operation will cause mechanical failures that standard tactics can exploit. The video feed showed federal tactical teams executing coordinated movements designed to provoke sustained, defensive fire from the modified weapons. Instead of the conventional approach of minimizing enemy firing opportunities, they were deliberately creating conditions that would force the suspects to maintain continuous automatic fire until thermal stress destroyed the weapon's enhanced capabilities. Cass watched the tactical implementation of her mechanical analysis with the focused attention of someone whose theoretical knowledge was being tested under life-and-death conditions. The modified weapons initially maintained their impossible firing rates, but sustained operation began producing the thermal effects she'd predicted. Muzzle flashes became irregular, firing rates became erratic, and the sustained automatic fire that had pinned down federal teams began experiencing the mechanical failures that excessive heat created in precisely modified components. Weapon malfunction confirmed on suspect positions 2 and 3, came the report from field commanders. Firing rates dropping to normal semi-automatic levels. Tactical teams advancing under covering fire. Within minutes, the courthouse engagement shifted from impossible standoff to conventional tactical situation as the modified weapons succumbed to thermal stress that their enhanced performance characteristics couldn't withstand. Federal teams advanced through positions that had been impregnable, while the weapons operated at impossible performance levels, but became vulnerable once mechanical failures reduced them to conventional capabilities. The crisis resolution validated everything Cass had demonstrated during her morning presentation, but under conditions that transformed theoretical understanding into operational success. Her knowledge of modification techniques had revealed vulnerabilities that formal training couldn't recognize, providing solutions that conventional expertise couldn't develop. As reports of successful suspect apprehension came through communication channels, the evidence vault fell silent except for the electronic hum of monitoring equipment. The federal experts who dismissed Cass's capabilities 24 hours earlier had just witnessed her knowledge save lives and resolve a crisis that their institutional expertise couldn't handle. The bartender who could assemble a Glock in 6 seconds had just proven that understanding how things worked was more valuable than knowing what they were supposed to do. And that unconventional expertise could solve problems that conventional training couldn't even recognize. The post-operation debriefing took place in a conference room that had hosted countless meetings about federal law enforcement successes, but none quite like this one. The large wall display showed a map of the courthouse area with tactical movement patterns that documented how Cass's mechanical analysis had transformed an impossible situation into a textbook resolution. 3 suspects in custody, no federal casualties, and weapons neutralized through methods that would revolutionize how law enforcement approached similar threats in the future. Agent Thornfield removed his tactical headset and placed it on the conference table with the deliberate precision of someone processing events that challenged his fundamental assumptions about expertise and problem solving. His 15 years of federal service had taught him to recognize superior performance, regardless of its source, and what he'd witnessed during the courthouse operation fell into that category without question. Preliminary reports from field teams confirmed that all 3 modified weapons experienced thermal failures exactly as Ms. Reeves predicted. He said, consulting notes that documented successful implementation of tactics based on mechanical understanding, rather than conventional law enforcement training. Sustained fire operations caused barrel expansion and component stress that reduced automatic capabilities to standard semi-automatic function within the specified time frame. The acknowledgement was professional and understated, delivered without dramatic flourishes or elaborate praise, but everyone in the room understood its significance. Federal tactical teams had successfully resolved a crisis using knowledge that institutional procedures had initially rejected, proving that unconventional expertise could provide solutions that formal training couldn't develop. Dr. Vance reviewed technical data collected during the courthouse engagement, her academic training, finally reconciling theoretical predictions with empirical results that had initially seemed impossible. The ballistics analysis showed exactly how thermal stress had disrupted the precision modifications that created impossible performance, validating mechanical principles that formal education had systematically excluded from engineering curricula. The stress analysis confirms that sustained operation pushes these modifications beyond safe operational parameters, she said, examining data that explained 3 weeks of analytical failures in language that her PhD training could finally comprehend. Ms. Reeves' identification of thermal vulnerabilities was based on understanding that our computer models couldn't predict because they didn't account for traditional manufacturing tolerances. The admission represented more than just technical acknowledgement. Dr. Vance was recognizing that her graduate-level expertise had limitations that practical knowledge could overcome, that formal training didn't guarantee comprehensive understanding, and that solving complex problems sometimes required insights that academic frameworks couldn't provide. Agent Carmichael compiled preliminary reports that would become official documentation of the operation, carefully noting the contribution of civilian expertise to successful resolution of a federal law enforcement crisis. The language was diplomatic and bureaucratically appropriate, but the substance was revolutionary. Formal acknowledgement that essential knowledge could come from sources that institutional procedures typically dismissed. Civilian technical consultant provided critical analysis that enabled successful tactical resolution, she wrote, creating official records that would preserve Cass's contribution without disrupting bureaucratic hierarchies or challenging institutional assumptions too dramatically. Unconventional analytical approaches identified operational vulnerabilities that standard assessment methods had not detected. Agent Hayes, whose military experience had taught him to value results over credentials, began developing tactical recommendations based on lessons learned from the courthouse operation. His report would influence how federal teams prepared for encounters with modified weapons, incorporating mechanical understanding into tactical training that had previously focused exclusively on conventional threats. These weapons are appearing in criminal investigations nationwide, he said, reviewing intelligence reports that showed the scope of the problem they just learned to solve. Federal teams need training in thermal vulnerability assessment and sustained fire tactics that can exploit mechanical limitations in modified weapons. Ms. Reeves' approach needs to be integrated into standard tactical protocols. Director Holloway synthesized the various reports and analyses into a comprehensive assessment that would influence federal law enforcement policy at the highest levels. The courthouse operation had demonstrated that bureaucratic procedures could overlook essential expertise, that formal credentials didn't guarantee practical competence, and that solving complex problems required intellectual flexibility that institutional thinking often discouraged. The successful resolution of this crisis validates the importance of consulting expertise that exists outside traditional institutional channels, she dictated to her administrative assistant, creating records that would protect her decision to include civilian knowledge in classified operations. Federal agencies should develop procedures for identifying and accessing unconventional expertise when conventional approaches prove inadequate. The official language was carefully diplomatic, but the substance represented a fundamental shift in how federal law enforcement would approach complex technical problems. Cass's contribution had proven that essential knowledge could exist in unexpected places, that practical understanding sometimes exceeded theoretical training, and that institutional prejudices could prevent agencies from accessing solutions to critical problems. Throughout the debriefing process, Cass remained quietly professional. answering technical questions with the same understated competence she'd demonstrated throughout the crisis. She provided additional documentation about modification techniques, explained theoretical principles that could help federal teams recognize similar weapons in future investigations, and offered to assist with training programs that would prepare law enforcement personnel for encounters with advanced modification techniques. Her contributions were accepted with respectful attention rather than dismissive skepticism, marking a complete transformation in how federal experts viewed her capabilities and knowledge. The bartender who'd been escorted from classified facilities 24 hours earlier was now being consulted about policy recommendations that would influence federal law enforcement operations nationwide. The meeting concluded without dramatic speeches or elaborate ceremonies, reflecting the professional culture of federal law enforcement, where results mattered more than recognition and competence was measured through outcomes rather than credentials. But everyone present understood that they'd witnessed something significant, proof that expertise could exist outside institutional boundaries, that unconventional knowledge could solve problems that conventional training couldn't address, and that bureaucratic procedures sometimes needed to be flexible enough to accommodate solutions that didn't fit established categories. As participants filed out of the conference room, their conversations carried a different tone than the dismissive exchanges of the previous day. Respect had been earned through demonstration rather than demanded through authority, and acknowledgement had come through results rather than credentials. The federal experts who'd questioned Cass's qualifications now understood that competence could take forms that institutional training didn't recognize or preserve. The courthouse crisis had been resolved, the modified weapons had been neutralized, and federal law enforcement had gained new capabilities for addressing threats that conventional approaches couldn't handle. The mission was complete, accomplished through knowledge that bureaucratic procedures had initially rejected, but practical necessity had ultimately validated. The transformation began subtly, like morning light gradually replacing darkness. When Cass returned to Murphy's Tap House 3 days after the courthouse operation, the familiar weight of the bartending apron felt different against her shoulders, carrying new meaning that extended beyond mixing drinks and managing customers. The warehouse district hadn't changed, but her place within it had shifted in ways that would take weeks to fully understand. Regular customers noticed the difference before anyone said anything explicit. Tom Morrison, a dock supervisor who'd been ordering the same beer and whiskey combination for 2 years, paused mid-conversation when he saw her behind the bar. There was something in her posture, a quiet confidence that seemed more defined than before, though he couldn't identify exactly what had changed about the woman who'd always served his drinks with professional competence. "Cass, you seem different tonight," he said, accepting his usual order with the comfortable familiarity of a customer who'd never needed to explain his preferences. "Something good happened recently?" She wiped down the bar with the same methodical care she'd always shown, but her movements carried the relaxed precision of someone whose capabilities had been properly recognized after years of being overlooked. "Just had an interesting consulting job," she replied, her tone suggesting significance without revealing details that federal classification requirements protected from casual conversation. The phone had been ringing more frequently in recent days, calls from numbers she didn't recognize asking questions that indicated word was spreading through networks that operated below official channels. A gunsmith in Portland wanted advice about modifications that matched descriptions, circulating among craftsmen who specialized in precision work. A federal marshal in Chicago requested consultation about weapons that seemed to exceed normal performance parameters. A detective in Miami mentioned her name in connection with an investigation involving firearms that exhibited impossible characteristics. None of the callers explained how they'd obtained her contact information, but the pattern suggested that reputation was building through the kind of informal communication networks that connected people who worked with their hands rather than their credentials. Knowledge was passing between craftsmen, investigators, and technical specialists who understood that some expertise couldn't be found through official channels or institutional directories. At Morrison's Industrial Supply, where she'd purchased materials for her demonstration weapon, employees greeted her with respectful attention that hadn't existed during previous visits. Jake Morrison, the owner's son who managed Precision Tool Sales, approached her with questions about metallurgical supplies that suggested he understood she was working on projects that exceeded typical hobbyist requirements. "Heard you've been doing some consulting work that impressed some federal people," he said while helping her select specialized files that most customers wouldn't recognize. "Word's getting around that you solved problems their experts couldn't handle. That true?" The question carried curiosity mixed with professional interest, reflecting the kind of informal information sharing that occurred within communities of skilled craftsmen. Cass's success had become validation for everyone who'd learned their expertise through practical experience rather than formal education. Proof that traditional knowledge could solve problems that institutional training couldn't address. "Sometimes old techniques work better than new ones," she replied, examining the file patterns with the careful attention of someone who understood exactly how each tool would perform under specific conditions. People forget that some problems were solved long before computers existed. The basement workshop beneath her apartment had acquired new significance as requests for consultation increased. Federal agencies weren't the only organizations facing weapons that exceeded conventional understanding. Private security firms, international law enforcement agencies, and specialized technical consultants were encountering similar problems with increasing frequency. Each consultation request validated her unique position as someone who bridged the gap between traditional craftsmanship and contemporary challenges. An envelope arrived from the Department of Justice containing a formal letter of appreciation for civilian assistance in federal law enforcement operations, carefully worded to acknowledge contribution without revealing classified details. The language was bureaucratically neutral, but the official letterhead and signature represented recognition that would open doors to consulting opportunities that hadn't existed before the courthouse operation. More importantly, a second envelope contained a business card from Director Holloway with a handwritten note requesting consultation on future cases involving modified weapons. The informal communication suggested that federal law enforcement was developing new approaches to technical challenges, incorporating expertise that institutional procedures had traditionally excluded from classified operations. The most significant change occurred during a chance encounter with Dr. Patricia Vance at a coffee shop near the Federal Building. The academic who'd questioned Cass's qualifications during their first meeting approached with the respectful attention of someone whose professional assumptions had been constructively challenged. "Ms. Reeves, I wanted to thank you for the education you provided about traditional manufacturing techniques," Dr. Vance said, settling into the chair across from Cass with coffee that suggested this was a planned meeting rather than coincidental encounter. "Your demonstration revealed gaps in my formal training that I hadn't recognized. I've been researching historical gunsmithing methods, and I'm beginning to understand how much practical knowledge has been lost as education became more theoretical." The conversation that followed lasted 2 hours, covering technical topics that bridged the gap between academic theory and practical application. Dr. Vance asked questions about traditional techniques with genuine intellectual curiosity, acknowledging that her PhD training had provided theoretical frameworks but not the tactile understanding that came from working with materials rather than studying them. "I'm developing a research proposal about integrating traditional craftsmanship principles into contemporary engineering education," Dr. Vance explained, showing notes that documented techniques Cass had demonstrated during the federal consultation. "Your approach suggests that formal education has systematically excluded knowledge that remains essential for solving certain types of problems. The academic validation represented more than personal recognition. It suggested that institutional attitudes were beginning to shift toward appreciation for knowledge that existed outside formal educational structures. Universities might begin incorporating traditional techniques into curricula that had previously focused exclusively on contemporary methods, preserving practical wisdom that technological advancement had nearly eliminated. Evening customers at Murphy's Tap House began asking different questions, their conversations reflecting awareness that their bartender possessed expertise that extended far beyond beverage service. Construction workers who'd always appreciated her competence now understood that her skills encompassed areas they'd never imagined, creating relationships that combined professional respect with personal familiarity. The warehouse district felt different as well, carrying new energy that came from having someone locally who'd proven that unconventional expertise could challenge institutional assumptions and solve problems that formal training couldn't address. Cass had become living proof that essential knowledge existed within working-class communities, that practical skills could exceed academic theory, and that expertise didn't require credentials for validation. The quiet transformation was complete. Respect had been earned through demonstration, recognition had come through results, and reputation was building through networks that valued competence over credentials. The bartender who could assemble a Glock in 6 seconds was no longer invisible to people who mattered, no longer dismissed by experts who confused formal training with actual understanding. 6 months after the courthouse operation, the story began appearing in places that Cass never visited, told by people who'd never met her but understood what her success represented. A grainy cell phone video surfaced on law enforcement forums, showing someone's hands disassembling a modified weapon with fluid precision that looked almost choreographed. No faces appeared in the footage, no identifying information, but the competence was unmistakable, and the techniques being demonstrated had started appearing in training programs across 3 federal agencies. The video's caption reads simply, 6 seconds. No formal training. Sometimes the best expertise comes from unexpected places. It was shared 47,000 times in the first week, spreading through networks that connected craftsmen, investigators, and technical specialists who recognized superior skill regardless of its source. Comment sections filled with discussions about traditional techniques that formal education had abandoned, practical knowledge that institutional training systematically excluded, and the difference between credentials and actual competence. At the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center in Georgia, instructors began incorporating modules that hadn't existed before Cass's demonstration. Thermal vulnerability assessment in modified weapons became required training for tactical teams, teaching federal agents to recognize and exploit mechanical limitations that conventional training had never addressed. The course materials credited civilian technical consultation for insights that had revolutionized how law enforcement approached impossible weapons, creating official acknowledgement that essential expertise could exist outside institutional boundaries. Detective Sarah Chun in Sacramento discovered one of the training videos during preparation for a case involving weapons that exhibited impossible performance characteristics. The techniques demonstrated in the footage allowed her team to neutralize threats using thermal stress methods that standard police training had never covered, saving lives in a situation that conventional approaches couldn't have resolved. Whoever created this training material understands weapons in ways that academy instruction never taught, Chun wrote in her after-action report, contributing to documentation that would influence law enforcement training nationwide. These techniques should be integrated into standard curriculum for any officer who might encounter modified weapons. The ripple effects extended beyond law enforcement into academic institutions that had begun questioning whether formal education was adequately preparing students for real-world challenges. Dr. Marcus Webb at the Colorado School of Engineering developed a research program examining traditional manufacturing techniques that contemporary curricula had eliminated, discovering precision methods that modern machinery couldn't replicate. We've been so focused on technological advancement that we've lost sight of fundamental principles that produced superior results for centuries. Dr. Webb explained during a presentation that would influence engineering education policy. This research suggests that formal training has systematically excluded knowledge that remains essential for solving certain categories of problems. His program attracted students who wanted to learn techniques that combined historical craftsmanship with contemporary applications, creating a new generation of engineers who understood that innovation sometimes meant recovering wisdom that institutional progress had discarded. The waiting list for his courses extended 2 semesters, filled with students who'd recognized that the most sophisticated solutions weren't always the most complex ones. International attention followed when Interpol requested consultation about modified weapons appearing in criminal investigations across 12 countries. The modification techniques had spread beyond American borders, creating global challenges that required expertise in traditional gunsmithing methods that few people possessed. Training materials based on Cass's demonstrations were translated into 7 languages, distributed to law enforcement agencies that were encountering impossible weapons with increasing frequency. Documentary filmmaker named Jennifer Martinez began researching stories about unconventional expertise after seeing the law enforcement training video. Her investigation led to workshops and communities where essential knowledge was preserved by people whose skills had never been formally recognized. Craftsmen who solved problems that institutions couldn't address using techniques that academic training had abandoned. There's an entire universe of expertise that exists outside official channels, Martinez explained during interviews for her film, Hidden Masters, the craftsmen who solve impossible problems. These are people who understand their fields at levels that formal education doesn't reach, who preserve knowledge that institutions have forgotten, and who can accomplish things that credentialed experts consider impossible. The documentary featured interviews with traditional craftsmen across various fields, each demonstrating capabilities that challenged assumptions about where expertise could be found and how complex problems should be solved. Cass appeared briefly in archival footage from federal training materials, her hands working with precision that spoke louder than any credentials could have proclaimed. Small manufacturing companies began seeking consultation from craftsmen who understood traditional techniques, discovering that some precision work required human sensitivity that automated systems couldn't replicate. An aerospace contractor in Seattle hired traditional metalworkers to solve tolerance problems that computer-controlled machinery couldn't achieve, finding that hand-filing techniques produced superior results at critical stress points. The trend influenced hiring practices across industries that had previously prioritized formal credentials over demonstrated competence. Human resources departments developed new assessment methods that evaluated practical skills alongside educational achievements, recognizing that essential capabilities could exist in people whose backgrounds didn't conform to institutional expectations. At Murphy's Tap House, the changes were more subtle but equally significant. The basement workshop had become an informal training center where young craftsmen learned techniques that formal education didn't preserve, passing knowledge between generations through hands-on instruction rather than theoretical study. Cass taught willing students the fundamentals of mechanical empathy, showing them how to understand materials through touch and experience rather than computer models and academic frameworks. Understanding comes through your hands, she explained to a group that included a recent engineering graduate, a retired machinist, and a high school student whose grandfather had been a gunsmith. You have to feel how metal wants to move, learn to work with its natural characteristics rather than forcing it to conform to theoretical predictions. The informal classes attracted attention from people who understood that some knowledge couldn't be acquired through conventional channels, that essential skills were disappearing as education became more theoretical and less practical. Word spread through networks that valued competence over credentials, bringing students who wanted to learn techniques that combined traditional wisdom with contemporary applications. Federal agencies quietly incorporated Cass's methods into standard procedures, creating protocols that acknowledged the value of consulting expertise that existed outside institutional boundaries. New guidelines encouraged investigators to seek knowledge from unconventional sources when conventional approaches proved inadequate, recognizing that bureaucratic procedures could prevent access to essential solutions. The lasting impact extended far beyond firearms expertise into broader questions about how society identified and preserved essential knowledge. Cass had proven that competence didn't require credentials for validation, that practical understanding could exceed theoretical training, and that solutions to impossible problems sometimes came from sources that institutional thinking systematically overlooked. Her story became shorthand for the importance of recognizing expertise wherever it existed, regardless of formal qualifications or institutional approval. In conference rooms and classrooms, training centers and workshops, people began asking different questions about knowledge and capability, understanding that the most important skills weren't always the most visible ones. The bartender who could assemble a Glock in 6 seconds had reminded an entire system that competence spoke louder than credentials, that results mattered more than recognition, and that the quiet mastery of essential skills was worth more than all the degrees and certifications that bureaucratic thinking could devise. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.